Afternoon geographers. First things first, apologies for the lack of content over the last few days. I've been preparing my own students for the paper 1 and paper 2 exams. Preparations can be fairly extreme, particularly for the paper 2. Now it's everyone's favourite paper, it's paper 3. However paper 1 and paper 2 have gone for you, paper 3 is a real opportunity for you to claw back some marks that you think you missed out on paper 1 and paper 2. Now, before we get into the video, and I've had a lot of requests for this already, I'm going to be running a series of paper 3 masterclasses, and they are on Monday, Tuesday and Wednesday of next week. The details for which are included in the link in my bio. So if you're interested in having a guided step-by-step process for which to prepare for paper 3, click on that link and you will see some information about that in there. Now, the reason people struggle with paper 3 is because the A-Level Geography is really tight as a course, and a lot of places only really have time to cover the content for paper 1 and paper 2. So paper 3 isn't necessarily built into the lesson planning just because it can't be. It's because there's too much content to get through, and that is one of the real areas of growth which you guys need. Now, I remember when I first started teaching paper 3 and I found it difficult. You're faced with a data set that you've got to make sense of, and your first response is, how do I make sense of all this? But then when I took a breath and I started to really break down the approach and did some research about what good analysis is and what a kind of step-by-step approach you can take is, then it started to become a little bit easier. Now, to a certain degree, sometimes it just is luck of the draw. Some people do have a very good ability to analyze data. They're naturals at it. The more mathematically, scientifically, logically minded people among us, they find analyze questions okay. But that doesn't mean that if you're not a natural at analysis that you can't do well. All you need is a strategy, and all you need is an approach, and that's what I'm taking you through today. An approach to the 8-marker analyze questions. Now, these are really tricky questions because that term analyze is quite tricky to define. It can mean different things for different questions, and it's not as though the mark schemes are very helpful. They're not very helpful for students anyway. It doesn't necessarily lay out the skills you need to show that are going to move you through the levels. So that's what I'm going to be going through in this video. But essentially, what you've got to do is make sense of that data set. You've got to cherry pick certain bits, you've got to summarize certain bits, and that's a very tricky skill. So let's get cracking. Now, it doesn't matter what the 8-mark question says. It can be analyze the difference, analyze the relationship, analyze the impacts. They all require you to demonstrate the same 4 key competencies, in my opinion. And if you can demonstrate these 4 key competencies, then you're on your way to a high-level mark in that 8-marker. Now, the way I always recommend my students approach an 8-marker is to build up those competencies through each of your paragraph. So in paragraph 1, show the lowest level skill, and then build it up to paragraph 2 when you're showing higher level skills than in paragraph 1, and in 3, higher level skills than 1 and 2, and so on and so forth until you get to that 4th paragraph. So what are these 4 competencies that I'm talking about? Okay, the first competency that you need to be able to demonstrate is spot the difference. Doesn't matter what your data set shows, you will usually be able to point out something that is the highest and something that is the lowest. Now, what this does is it shows the examiner that you can actually interpret the data in front of you, read from it, and please, please, please make sure you quote from that data set. That's the first skill. Spot the highest, spot the lowest. Okay, so ultimately picking that out as sort of our headline data. What's the main headline data? What can we see? It's highest, lowest, high, low, more, less. That's it. So what about the second one? It's not enough, if you want to get a high level response, to just pick out the facts that we can see different numbers. The next skill you want to be focusing on then in your second paragraph is significance. Okay, so these two are different, but how different? Sometimes you can say that it's 100% more, or it's 50% of this. So you're looking at a percentage difference. Or you could do multiples or ratios. So we could say that this is 10 times higher than this. Ultimately though, it doesn't matter how you do it, as long as you are showing that competency of significance. So if we do that in our second paragraph, what the examiner immediately sees then is, okay, they've been able to interpret the data set and they've been able to show me or calculate the significance of the differences between these data sets. The next skill you need to show is grouping. So when we've done the highest and the lowest, what we've done there is we've focused in on one individual bit of data and another bit of individual data, and we've shown the difference in those. What you will normally find is that the data is clustered. So as an example, these might be the names of certain countries, and we could say that that all these types of countries show this particular quality. Okay, so we're grouping together the data. And it could be something like country X, Y, Z, and 1, 2, 3 all have gender equality scores of 30, whereas countries A, B, C, D, and 5, 6, 7 all have gender equality scores of 70 plus. So what we've shown the examiner there is that we can spot that there may be some kind of relationship that's starting to develop in the data set. So grouping together things of similar value. And then what we can try to do, again, using our skills of significance and using our skills of actually making this data here relevant to the real world, we can then start to get a little bit more clever with our data. So what we might say is 80% of countries with a gender equality score of 30 and under also have a GDP of less than, say, 12 billion. Whereas with gender equality scores of 70 plus, 100% of the countries have GDPs that are maybe 10 times or more the size of the countries that we've already established here. Now that skill, that's really high level analysis skill. Not only have we grouped it, but we've also done statistical calculations on the significance within this particular data set, and then we've linked it to another data set as well, or another variable. And what we're showing the examiner there is that we can look at data, two different data sets, and establish some kind of relationship. And then all we have to do is link that to theory in some way, shape, or form. So for example, maybe there's better gender equality scores in places with a high GDP, because a high GDP is sometimes indicative of strength of governance and potentially greater integration into the globalized world, and potentially higher levels of political globalization, which means that there's policies in place to create a more equal society for women. Something along those lines. It doesn't matter what the theory is, as long as from your groupings you are also linking it to some kind of geographical theory. So let's recap, where have we come from? So we have our lowest level skill, which is spot the difference. Go for highest, go for lowest, and quote. So that'll score you some marks. Then we're thinking about the significance. So we already established that there's a difference between these two scores. So what's the percentage difference? What's the ratio? Is it 10 times greater? Is it half this? That's how we do significance. And then we really start to ramp up the marks when we can then start to establish groupings. So we look across the data set and we think, okay, we can group this set together. We can group this set together. And then can we establish any relationships between this and another data set? So 80% of countries, 12 billion GDP. 100% of countries have GDPs of 10 times greater than anyone in this grouping. So that's all it is at this stage. We're just trying to demonstrate competencies to the examiner. There's not one correct answer in your 8 markers. All there is a way of you writing so that you can show the competencies that will allow you to get higher level marks. And then the final skill that we can show, which is not necessarily more complex than anything that we've covered before, but number 4 is where we can establish some anomalies. If in this part here we've established a relationship or we've established a trend that we've summarized, are there areas of the data set that don't necessarily conform to this? So for example, can we spot areas in the data set where there might be a very high GDP but a very low gender equality score? And again, what can we put that down to? We've got to link that to some sort of theory. So there are your competencies. Now let's have a look at this in practice. So this is your typical analysis question. Analyze the relationship between levels of economic development and environmental degradation. So the first thing you need to do is establish what exactly is it that I'm being asked to analyze. And it's the relationship. So we need to use that language in our analysis. There will be a relationship that we can establish on this chart here. We've just got to find out what that is. And then remember, we've got to employ our core competencies so that the examiner can give us a higher level mark. And remember, these are spot the difference, significance, establish groups, and then explain that with a little bit of theory. And then of course we've got our anomalies. And remember, what you're doing is you're building up your paragraphs showing these core competencies. So this will be paragraph 1, this will be paragraph 2, this will be paragraph 3, and then this will be paragraph 4. And it's a really easy way of structuring your approach and showing that you can get that range of analytical skill into your answers. So let's try with this data set here. So what we've got here is levels of environmental degradation, which would probably have a numbering system on the side here that you could then interpret and read off. On the x-axis down here, we've got GDP per capita. So GDP per capita is a measure of levels of economic development. And you may have another data set that also shows other types of data for levels of economic development, but we are just going to focus our efforts on this particular chart right here. So let's go through that first competency first. Now we can immediately see that there are some differences that we can establish from this data set. So it appears that these countries here, A, B, C, D and E, they have the highest GDPs per capita and the lowest levels of environmental degradation. So for example, you might quote D here, and therefore you've established the highest, already picking up marks. Whereas what we could then do is, when we're conforming to where the bulk of the data is, we might choose to pick out O, P and Q. And these have some of the highest scores for environmental degradation, and they are around the mid-range in terms of GDP per capita. But then we could also point out 3, 4 and 5 that they have some of the lowest scores in terms of environmental degradation, but some of the lowest GDPs per capita. So what we've done there is we've pointed out highest and lowest, but what we've established is that the relationship needs to be explored further. And then remember, what we would do is we would quote from these figures. So with 2 observations within our first paragraph, maybe we've gotten ourselves 2 marks out of 8 already, just for picking out highest GDP per capita, but lowest environmental degradation, and mid-range GDP per capita, highest levels of environmental degradation. We've already started to pick up what the relationship is. But when the environmental degradation is low, GDP per capita can also be low as well. So we've already started to establish that lowest level skill. Next up, remember then, we just need something that shows the examiner that we can give some kind of indicator of the significance of the differences between the data sets. So we might choose to do this one. So the difference between this and this, GDP per capita may be 10 times higher between C and P, and therefore environmental degradation might be 20 times lower between those 2 nations there. However, between 5 and P, it's also maybe 20 times lower on this side, and again 20 times lower in terms of the environmental degradation. So it doesn't matter what you pick out, and it doesn't matter what you do, ratios, percentages, anything like that, we can see that you've shown the difference in the significance between those data sets. Next up, we then have our groupings. Now groupings, we've already started to do groupings to a certain degree with these nations here, but what we can see is that the data set shows a real divide. So what our chart here shows is that over a certain GDP per capita, the relationship that we can start to establish is, with increasing GDP per capita, levels of environmental degradation will decrease. However, between this GDP per capita here and this GDP per capita here, when there's an increase up to that certain point, levels of environmental degradation will actually increase. So for this particular chart here, that's how we would decide to group. And we might decide to do groupings with another piece of data or another kind of chart in a different way. But it doesn't matter how you do the groupings. That's how I've decided to do the grouping. What I've done by doing that is just show that I can group together data sets that show a certain thing. Look, by grouping together, I can now start to establish the relationship. Now then comes the point of obviously adding in our theoretical explanation, which I think you can probably see where we're going with this. That's right, this conforms here to the environmental Kuznets curve. So then all we would do is we would add in a little bit of theoretical explanation for the relationship that we see. From here to here, obviously we've got subsistence agriculture down here, very low GDP per capita, and then that starts to increase over time with increasing GDP per capita, because obviously this represents countries that are at the different stages of modernization and industrializing. So already there, I've got in a few more theories. I've got the environmental Kuznets curve, and I've got modernization theory as well. But then obviously as we reach peak industrialization past a certain point with GDP per capita, the relationship then inverts, and that is when we bring in environmental legislation such as things like afforestation programs, tighter laws on waste disposal, and everything that could be considered decreasing levels of environmental degradation on this side, but as GDP per capita still increases. So there we have it. We've got our first 3 paragraphs that show the examiner that we've got those core competencies of I can read off the data set, I can interpret the chart or the figure, I can spot high and low, I can show the significance of the difference between high and low, I can form groups within the data set, which then leads me on to talk about my relationships, and I can finally explain this relationship by linking it to wider geography and certain theories within the specification. The final skill now is to spot our anomalies, taking in all of these skills here as well, but also explaining that with theory. So as we can see, there are some anomalies. There are some outliers on this particular chart. They are here and here. So those that don't conform to the relationship that we've already established. So as we can see here, there's very low GDP per capita, but high levels of environmental degradation. Very high GDP per capita, but very high levels of environmental degradation. degradation. So on either side, it doesn't conform to what we would expect to see. And then we could potentially speculate as to why that is. So in this case here, we've got low GDP per capita and high environmental degradation. Maybe these are countries that are under the resource curse. So typically GDP per capita is extremely low in these countries because they are primary products dependent. Maybe they're run by corrupt governments, maybe the distribution of wealth is not even, and therefore we have high levels of environmental degradation, because often resource extraction does involve high levels of environmental degradation, such as deforestation. That's a prime example there. And look, we've got some theory in there about the resource curse. Over here, usually high levels of GDP per capita are associated with nations that export fossil fuels, very high GDP. However, they might be small populations, but there still might be high levels of environmental degradation, because ultimately the exploitation of resources will always involve some kind of environmental degradation. So that's it. That's it with 8 markers. That's all we have to do. We have to take the data set, we demonstrate the competencies, and the examiner then has the evidence within the marks to say they have demonstrated higher level competency. I can now put them in the 7 to 8 mark bracket. So give it a go. Download your paper 3s and see if you can try this on your own. Best of luck with your paper 3 preparations. Look out for more videos that I'm going to be putting up about your 18 and your 24 mark questions. Thanks very much.